You know what I just got yesterday that I'm so excited about? I got my TBR bookshelf. I popped into the local Habitat type store right after I got a root canal. I was slightly doped up on anti-anxiety medication, but there was something going on with the tire, and the store is right next to the tire guys. So I was like, let me pop in there and see if they have any furniture for my room, because I still have a couple spots that I'm looking for stuff. And I went in there and they had this perfect little bookshelf, and I had like 5 TBR piles. I have a problem with the TBR pile. And this bookshelf fits perfectly, and it is real wood. And now all my TBR pile has a home. I can't fit like one more book on there though. And because I was on the anti-anxiety medication, as soon as I hauled it up the stairs and stalked it all excitedly, I fell into a complete unconscious state on my bed, fully clothed. And I woke up and I was like, oh my God, there's a bookshelf here. Hello friends, my name is Lydia Foxglove and I'm a fantasy author. I've been a full-time fantasy author since 2009, and I've been both traditionally and indie published. So welcome or welcome back. And today I'm going to talk about plotting again. I did a video that was like the very basics that you want to have before you plot and plan a novel recently. And today I'm going to talk about more of like the in-depth, more confusing part of plotting. I'm going to talk about a couple of things because the book that I'm working on currently, I'm working on a few books, but I've been dealing with a lot of like this brain fog. And there's this story that I really want to write because I know the characters so well, but I've been trying to put it off because it's out of sequence of like I wanted to sit down and tell the story of my fantasy world properly in sequence. That seemed like it would make sense. So I've been resisting telling this story. The other thing about it is that I have tried to write it a few times and it's always been a failure. And it makes sense to me why it's been a failure in hindsight. I asked my Discord people, like, should I write this or am I being crazy? Should I stick to telling things in sequence? And they were all like, if you are really drawn to write it, just write it. So I've talked about the story before because I've tried to release it twice in the past. This was the first indie published version, and this was the second one. But there's been actually many incarnations of this book, a ridiculous amount. So I thought it would be a good time to talk about like how to plot through the lens of mistakes were made. Because there's some things that you just don't learn until you've written a few books or a dozen books or 60 books, maybe, if you're me. Maybe you have to write 60 books to learn how to do it. I don't know. Maybe I'm not even there yet and I have to write 200 books. I don't know. Anyway, the first version of this story that I wrote was like 2003 or something. It was pretty much just like a fluffy little romance that I wrote about these two characters to kind of comfort me after the girl that I was doing like role-playing chat with in the world got very busy, got a new girlfriend. I kind of felt like I was being dumped, even though we were not in a romantic relationship or any kind of, you know, she wasn't obligated to me in any way, but I still felt like I was getting dumped. So to comfort myself, I just wrote like pure romance between this boss from an organized magical crime family and a like country girl, and they were drawn to each other because they were such opposites, and it wasn't supposed to be anything that was going to capture my attention for decades to come. But the characters themselves ended up being really vivid and felt extremely real to me in a way that not all characters do. And I couldn't let them go, so I started thinking about them more, like how could I actually make a real book about these two? There were a number of interim variations that we won't talk about, but eventually I wrote the vengeful half. At the time that I was writing this book, I was a traditionally published young adult author. So I had to age the characters down to be teenagers to conform to what I was like known for. Indie publishing was still pretty new, and I had an agent who didn't even rep adult books, so it didn't even cross my mind to let them stay adults. I was like, you have to make them be teenagers. So a lot of things got changed, just like teening them. And I sent it to my agent like several times. She probably started to hate me, and she never really like loved it. Eventually I dumped my agent over this book and tried to find a new agent. No agent liked it. I self-published it. Didn't do that well. And I told myself I should probably put it aside. But that didn't last very long because I loved the character so much that I started indie publishing, and I wrote the Cursed Soul trilogy, which did pretty well. And I also wrote Beauty and the Goblin King, which did really well. And therefore I started thinking, I've learned a lot about indie publishing, so I'm going to pick this book up and rewrite it. At the time, urban fantasy was hot, so I tried to now rewrite it with more of the urban fantasy genre stuff. This version ended up being really fast-paced. It's like 200 pages. Very short book. And they're adults again, and I tried to throw in as many like urban fantasy-ish things as I could without compromising the story. And since writing this book, I've since written like 45 books. I think this was like my 15th completed manuscript, and this one was only like 6th or something. So these were actually both really early in my career as a whole. I've written so many books since then, and I've learned so much in doing so. Even though a lot of those books were just kind of like fluffy, you still learn a lot from writing that kind of thing. So when I thought about rewriting this story and I looked back at the old versions, I had such a weird feeling of like, whoa, who wrote these? They seem so strange to me. And the thing is, I could have left them up for sale because, you know, they were done and they were set in the same world as the Cursed Soul trilogy and Doll Girl Meets Dead Guy. So why didn't I just leave them up? Well, the obvious reason is because I wrote them to conform first to the young adult traditionally published market and then to the urban fantasy trend in indie publishing circa 2017. So even though I liked the characters, I was not very proud of how the story ended up being out there. And as soon as it flopped, I was like, what are you doing? No, no, no. Like, if I'm gonna write it, whether it's gonna succeed or not, it needs to fit with me, not with a trend of the moment. But it's through looking at these older versions that I've learned a few things about plotting. Rather, I've realized some things that I've learned about plotting that sometimes are hard to tell until you've just done it a lot. So maybe I can tell you guys some of the things that I've learned. It might help you a little earlier on in your journey than 60 books in, hopefully. That is always my goal here, to spare you at least like 10% of the workload that I have put in over the years. So the first thing that I thought when I looked at Fortune's Curse was, it's one thing to write to a trend when that really is your goal. You're just trying to make money as a writer, and you want to find something that's a trend that's guaranteed, or at least like kind of guaranteed to sell, while still being something that you enjoy. But if you have a fantasy world that you've been writing about for 30 years with like a century-long history that you are ultimately hoping to tell, then writing that to a fleeting trend is gonna just give you something embarrassing. So my first bit of advice is, if you're gonna have a career as a writer and you're trying to think long-term, think about consistency. It's very hard for any writer to stay perfectly consistent throughout their same career, that you always write the same genre, the same tone. That's hard. You will get bored. But when I'm thinking now about my fantasy world, when I was writing these earlier versions, I was mainly thinking about like, well, what's going to be trendy right now? Should I make it a little darker? Should I make it a little funnier? Should I make the characters older, younger? I was just thinking about the trends. Now I'm thinking longer term. So I'm like, what is a consistent branding that when I tell someone about the Hidden Lands, I can say that while the books have some variation, they're all going to offer you this thing. In my case, I really like writing books that are like kind of cozy adjacent. Some of them are cozy fantasy, but more often they have some traumatic events now and then or some heavier events, but there's a lot of comforting aspects. Found family is a big one. There's a lot of those kind of domestic scenes, like slice of life type plotting. That's the tone that I want to maintain. So whether you read like the darkest, heaviest story and the lightest one, you still get that sense of cohesion, that hopefully all the characters would be people that you would enjoy sitting down to have a cup of tea and a pastry with. So when I'm thinking about the rewrite for this book, I'm thinking that I want to maintain that tone because it's about a magical organized crime family, and I could take it in a dark place, but now it seems very clear to me that that would not match the vibe that people are starting to hopefully come to expect from me. So I'm not going to take it in the darkest possible direction. I wouldn't like it the best either, but I could see a younger me, you know, reading like a Holly Black novel, for example, and thinking, oh, this tone, this might work, like this might sell if I paired my concept with the Holly Black tone and like trying to be Holly Black, and I would obviously fail because that is not where my heart is. So when I'm thinking about my end goal for the story now, I want it to end up where the characters are in like a pretty good place. It is not going to be the story of like their descent into darkness and all the temptations of evil and power. I mean, you know, there will be some of that, but I don't want them to end up there. So that's always going to be in my mind while I'm writing out a new plot line. The second thing I noticed is that I was throwing like every character and concept from my fantasy world that I could into this one book because at the time it seemed like this is my chance. The problem with that is that you end up with a mess of too many things trying to get the reader's attention. And then if you did end up getting to write a ton of books, like you've thrown everything into this one book and now you have to sort out. It's like you just threw all the Christmas lights together without organizing them, and now they're all tangled up, and your whole process is going to be trying to untangle the fact that you put every character and mentioned every plot concept in one book. Another thing I noticed, and actually this probably gets back to the second point that I made about not having a grasp of what tone that I wanted to settle on. But when I read this, I feel like I have no idea where it's going. I have like some notes of where I thought it might go. They don't feel very coherent. It feels like mainly I just enjoyed spending time with these characters and I really didn't know where I was sending them. That I was perfectly happy just having them just kind of meander around wherever the hell. And when you're kind of in a beginner to intermediate stage as a writer, I think this can be somewhat of a common problem, especially if you have grand ambitions to write these big stories and you don't really know how to plot very well yet. And this is what sometimes leads to that feeling when you're reading someone's work or even in your own work, and it feels like there's something missing and you can't quite pinpoint what it is because you might be like, well, the writing's pretty good. I like the characters. You got some interesting concepts here. What is the thing that's missing? It is the author's vision of where the book is going and what the point of it is ultimately. If you were truly writing like a slice of life comic book, maybe. I feel like comic books are the only stories that really get away with this, or like sitcoms or something. But in a novel, even if it's partly subconscious, you really want like this theme and this like arc to carry through however many books you're going to write. It just really helps if there's some kind of vision, even if it's just like a one sentence mission statement. Here's where I want to take these characters ultimately. From the start of the book, I can tell that I didn't have that. That I was just like, I like these people. Let's see what they do. And the fourth thing that I noticed is that I just pace this thing like a breakneck pace. You'd think that if I loved these characters so much, I wouldn't be in such a damn hurry to tell their story and call it a day, because I'm just like whizzing through the plot. It's like they meet, and there's a bunch of action, and there's a little bit of banter, and then there's a bunch more action, and there's a little more banter, and there's like dramatic reveals of some information, and it's over. It does not feel like the great love story of our ages that it was in my head. Like, in my head, I'm writing Outlander, and on the page, I don't know what I'm writing, but it's something really, really fast. And there's nothing wrong with a short book. In fact, some of the books on my keeper shelf that I think are really romantic are also quite short. But those books tend to be like a little more of like a little fairy tale, or the romance is just like a cute side aspect. The pacing of the book needs to match the scope of the story, and this is a huge fantasy world that I have with all this back history and cultures, and then I've got these rich characters and they all have family, and there's a lot going on, and this is not a book that you should be able to jam into barely 200 words, but I did, and now I just feel like there's a lot more. Like, I just wasn't confident enough to let the story unfold gently and let the characters get to know each other better. So I sat down with Fortune's Curse and flipped through it, and I made a new outline. I just want to talk about a couple of things that I'm doing differently. Chapter 1 of Fortune's Curse begins with our protagonist, Olivia, who remains in every draft as she starts off. Just kind of a simple, humble, like a good, cozy protagonist. She likes to garden. She likes antiques. She likes books. She's a little bit introverted, but there's a part of her that has been pushed into being an introvert, who is curious about having a grander life with more adventure. Only in every version there is something that has kept her from doing so. Usually it's been something about her mother's past. Her mother has been murdered and she doesn't know who murdered her. And there's a sense that she might have enemies, so maybe it's safer to just stay home. So she's living her simple life, and then she is approached by a mystery man in a suit who is asking about her mother. And she's immediately wary because she doesn't know who killed her mother, but she knows her mother was involved in some serious magical business. But he convinces her to talk to him at least. And at the end of the first chapter, then some other guys appear and kidnap her without being so polite about it. So a lot happens in this first chapter. When I looked at this, I thought, no, this is way too much to happen in the first chapter. You know, I'm like picking up this notebook, like I'm gonna tell you what happens in the new outline, and this is the wrong notebook because I have way too many notebooks. But whatever, I already wrote the new first chapter, so I can just tell you that in the first chapter, it is just establishing Olivia's quiet life and hinting at the fact that her mother was murdered and that there's kind of a mystery about it, and she's curious about leaving her little village, but she's also wary of doing so. Basically just setting up her background, and that's it. So then in chapter 2 of the original, Alfred is now standing in Olivia's house, which also I need to change Olivia's name. It no longer makes any sense for her to have like an Earth name, but I'll get back to that. We'll just say Olivia, placeholder. So Alfred's standing in Olivia Placeholder's house, wondering, well, I'm the one who came to talk to her. Who are these guys? He immediately suspects that, like, his mobster father is in on some kind of plan to, like, maybe have him play, like, the good cop, and then the bad cop kidnaps her. He just knows there's something going on with the families, because when you're in these organized crime families and weird stuff goes down, you know that, you know, that's why. So Alfred searches the house, he finds her spell book, and then he's like, all right, let's go home. I gotta ask my father what the heck is going on. So that's the original first 2 chapters. And because it unfolds like this, Olivia started to warm to Alfred a tiny bit, and then she does not trust him because she's been kidnapped. She thinks that maybe he led the kidnappers to her. She's like, feels like they want something from her, and she's generally very suspicious of him. And within 200 pages, they're like in love, which is just way too quick for her to go from not even trusting him for good reason to being smitten with him. So now the second chapter of the book is just Alfred, and it doesn't have any of Olivia in it, and it's just establishing the thing that Alfred loves the most currently, which is hunting for lost magic. At this point in the story, the big war that's going on in the Cursed Soul trilogy and Doll Girl Meets Dead Guy ended like 40 years ago, and after the war, after things kind of calmed down and the world started to modernize, magic started to die off considerably because there weren't any wars anymore, so there was a lot less call for dangerous magic, and a lot of it got outlawed, and just people are distracted with the modernizing world. Magic certainly isn't gone, but a lot of forms of it are starting to seem a little antiquated. Alfred's family has always dealt in selling magical artifacts, going back to when they were perfectly legal, but as they started to become illegal, then they started to become an organized crime outfit. And Alfred is passionate about this business, and the main reason is that he loves the idea of all the weird little magic and all the things that different sorcerers have discovered over millennia in their spell books and like regional magic. He loves all of it and is just depressed at the idea that it could fade away and that the knowledge could be lost. So really his motive for being in the business is to preserve the magic. Most of the bosses, though, including his father, don't share his passion for the actual process and all the knowledge base. They just want to have as much money and power as possible. And in a lot of cases, like, it's a few spells that make you the most money. The common, like, aggressive spells that everybody wants to buy, and everybody wants, like, suppliers who will make more of them. So Alfred has a real reason to want to stay in the family business, but he also has a reason to be at odds with his father. In the earlier versions of the story, this was often kind of like a little background tidbit about Alfred, that he loves the actual magic part of the magic dealing business, and that he likes hunting for treasures and like abandoned sorcerer castles and caves and trying to buy collections off of descendants, and he's like Mr. One-Man Antiques Roadshow, but just about finding magic stuff all over whenever he gets a chance to do it. And I realized this was like a really good way to actually establish his character, is to show him on the hunt for this magic, because then you really understand why the business is important to him. As the book goes on, there's a lot of reasons why it would be easier if he would just leave the business and just settle down with Olivia and have a good life with her. The only reason I really established why he would stay in the business was merely pride, but there really was another reason, and I thought I really need to show why this is so important to him. I want, in fact, you to root for Alfred to be like the supreme boss, as like not just a guy who deals in magical artifacts, but a guy who is preserving the legacy of magic, because that's kind of one of the themes of the story overall. Like, one of the reasons I'm talking about the Dragon Kingdom and the Broken Queen is because it's like the most ancient magic, and there's this theme throughout the whole story of like, what do we lose when we lose the old ways? In our own world, there's a lot of old ways that we've lost. We don't want a lot of these things in our lives anymore, and there's also things we've lost as we start to pull away from them. And I love the idea of a fantasy world exploring those themes and asking, like, what do we lose when we lose the old ways, and what do we gain from modern ways, and vice versa. So leading off Alfred's story with that feels like such a better way thematically to start that part of the story. And I'm going to leave it off there because I feel like that was plenty I feel like I've talked for a while. But the reason I wanted to share this with you guys is because I think some of this, even though it's very particular to my story, it might give you some things to think about in your own writing, because these are things that you don't necessarily get from like a basic writing book that lays out like a formula. Here's how you tell this kind of story. There's certain things that, like, just as you write a lot, you start to think more deeply about little things and think of the ways that you might enrich a story. And I'm always thinking, like, how do I really become great at this? And there's no easy answer to that. And I don't know if I will ever be considered a great writer by anybody. Like, I can't control that. But what I can control is just always trying to think deeply about my craft. And sometimes it does help to look back at a story and retell it many times, because that's when I really can see, like, oh gosh, these are the things that I chose to do before that I would never do now. And it was only all the experience that brought me to this point where I can see it. So I wanted to share those insights with you, and maybe some of them will resonate with you too. And I guess that's about it for now. There'll probably be some more videos like this. Anyway, if you've gone through any of these kinds of insights or any of this resonated with you, let me know in the comments. As always, if you want more content from me, you can sign up for my $5 tier on Substack or Patreon, where you get access to my Discord, free monthly bonus video, and you also will play a huge part in just supporting that these videos keep coming. But I appreciate each and every one of you for being here so much, and I will see you next time. Bye!